For those who study history, the Second World War can be fascinating, and at times an outright horrifying black mark on the history of our world. We think of the loss of life in major battles, the collateral damage of civilian lives turned upside down, and most grotesque of all, the Holocaust. An event so horrific it will never and should never be forgotten nor repeated. The world remembers that the Holocaust took the lives of 6 million Jewish people, gypsies, political prisoners, and many more. We think of the gas chambers, the furnaces, the final solution. When we dig a little deeper, we find further atrocities and the experiments undertaken by people like Der Todesengel, the Angel of Death, Joseph Mengele. As it is so vivid and in our face, we often fail to look anywhere else. Far too often are other stories forgotten. One of the worst, stemming from a unit in the Third Reich's ally, Japan, a top-secret unit charged with the research and development of biological and chemical weapons. One that not only created biological weapons for the Imperial Army, but was responsible for cruel and lethal human experimentation that between the years of 1937 and 1945 found themselves responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 280 and 500,000 people. This is one of the stories you've never heard. So welcome back for an all-new season of the Insidious Agenda Podcast. As always, I'm Nick, your host, and this story is Chapter 41, titled Human Experiments, the True Story of Japanese Unit 731. So get comfortable, dim your lights, quiet your mind, and listen as it all goes quiet. We're almost there. Now you're outside. Let my voice be your guide. Keep a steady stride. Into the further we go. The period in history in the late 1930s through the mid-1940s was one of the most detestable. We often look at it and call it the greatest generation through its stories of heroism and triumph over both seemingly insurmountable odds and the tyrants that drew a dark curtain over the European continent. History, of course, is always written by the victor. When it comes to this period, we hone in on the event I touched on in the intro, the Holocaust. I'm not measuring one against the other when it comes to this episode, as one crime against humanity is no less impactful than the other. However, today's story often gets less of a spotlight because of the research and time put into remembering the Holocaust and the fact that it could never be hidden. Humanity often turns its eyes away from things like Unit 731, or the major event that preceded it, the rape of Nanking. Even more so, we look away from the atrocities of the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, who can arguably be considered the worst mass murderer in human history. But today, we head back to Imperial Japan to pull back the curtain on a much less talked about atrocity. It wasn't until the year 1984 that Japan officially acknowledged the program that had so long been denied. Following the conflict between the Japanese and Chinese in the Manchurian incident of 1932, Japan decided that this was the location in which they would found their secret experimentation. This was viewed as a cleaner way of going about this research due to the separation of what would become future atrocities from the island of Japan itself. With that being said, they seemed to view the Chinese as being no-cost research subjects, for which the conquered land had an abundance of them. In 1932, Japanese Surgeon General Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, the chief medical officer for the Japanese Army, was given command of the AEPRL, or Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory, under the Tokyo Army Medical College and its dean, Minister Sadao Araki. While at the head of this unit, General Ishii stood up the top-secret research organization that was given the nickname Togo. It was the Togo unit's responsibility to conduct chemical and biological weapons research in Manchuria. His Togo unit was founded on the belief that Western nations were already well underway in their development of newer and more deadly biological weaponry. One of Ishii's biggest supporters was Colonel Chihiko Koizumi, a man who became Japan's health minister during the period of 1941 and 1945. Koizumi had a fascination with chemical weapons, having joined a research committee for poison gas in 1915. His interest was spurred on by having witnessed and marveled at the use of chlorine gas by Germany in the First World War at Ypres. Sometimes referred to as mustard gas due to its color, chlorine gas claimed the lives of 5,000 people and inflicted lasting damage on a further 15,000. It was Ishii's idea to use Chinese people in conquered Manchuria, as, in his words, they could be plucked from the streets like rats. Of course, in 1925, the Geneva Protocol outlawed the use of biological and chemical weapons, so everything the Japanese were doing from that point forward was forced into the highest levels of secrecy. Now, I've made reference to the fact that one of the main lines of effort for the AEPRL was to research and develop new biological weaponry. But they didn't abandon research on other things, such as new ways to protect Japanese soldiers from disease. With that being said, the ultimate goal was still to create a new way in which Japan would be able to spread epidemics within the lines of its enemies. Ishii and his unit needed somewhere to conduct the experimentation for their research. They settled on an old established prison camp known as Zhongma. Later, this became known as the Zhongma Fortress, or Zhongma City, in the town of Beihind, outside of Harbin. The Zhongma prison camp previously saw use throughout the Second Sino-Japanese War. The fortress covered an area of 103,500 square meters. It had 3 layers of courtyards, separated by 3-meter-high earthen walls, adorned with electrified barbed wire at the top. It was also protected by a moat, and the only way in or out was via a drawbridge over it. Inside the walls, Zhongma had hundreds of rooms, many small laboratories, offices, barracks, dining facilities, warehouses, munition storage, crematoria, and prison cells. Sadly, a fortress that eventually became a horrific place for many Chinese people was built by Chinese slave labor. Those who were forced to work on the base were escorted to their work site each day by armed guards and given blinders so that they could not see what they were constructing. Those unfortunate builders who found themselves building the structures inside the fortress were executed once the construction of their area was complete. Those who were forced to build Zhongma were a mixture of criminals, bandits, anti-Japanese partisan fighters, and political prisoners. Many who were convicted on false charges from the Japanese Kempeitai, the Imperial Army's military police. They were drawn from nationalities of Chinese, Soviet, Mongolian, and Korean people. One of the best descriptions of what happened inside Zhongma was taken from the diary of Saburo Endo, an officer in the Kwangtung Army's combat staff in 1933. In his November 16th entry, he wrote the following, loosely translated as, "At 8:30 in the morning, I went to the experimental field in the traffic squadron, together with Adachi Ozu and Tachibana, to inspect the conditions of the equipment. According to the first class, the electrical experiment was in charge, and the second class was in charge of poisonous gas. Division of venom experiments. 2 communist bandits were used for the experiment. Recently, people who have used phosgene gas in the gas chamber after a 5-minute experiment caused pneumonia and have survived until yesterday, while those who have been injected with 15 milligrams of cyanic acid compounds lose consciousness after only 20 minutes. After repeated experiments with a high voltage current of 20,000 volts, the person still was not dead. Finally, he was killed by injecting venom. The second person, through repeated experiments with a high voltage of 5,000 volts, did not kill him. Finally, he was burned to death after the current was continuously turned on for several minutes." Within the walls of Zhongma, human experimentation came to the forefront. The prisoners, often referred to as maruta, or logs, were even hidden from the view of local people and authorities. The guards and staff at the camp used the cover story of Zhongma being a lumber mill. The living conditions for the prisoners was actually better than you might expect for most prison camps. They were fed extremely well, a diet that consisted of rice, wheat, meat, and fish. Occasionally, they found themselves so fortunate they were given alcohol. This was all in an effort to keep the prisoners living a normal life, so the results of future experiments wouldn't be thrown off. I'll offer you some context now for some of these experiments that took place. One experiment had the prisoners slowly drained of the blood in their body over a number of days. Alternatively, some were deprived of nutrients or subject to forced dehydration. All the while, scientists took notes on the prisoners, noting the progress of the deterioration of their bodies and the effects that each and every test had on them. Other prisoners suffered forced injections under the guise of being vaccinations. These injections contained horrible things, like bubonic plague bacteria, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and many other deadly pathogens, again, with scientists watching closely the effects they had on the body over time. The most horrific methods of experimentation were still to come. One favorite was vivisection. This is the practice of performing operations on living humans for scientific research. The only issue is that the experiments with a vivisection-centric focus were done without the administration of anesthesia. One can only imagine the horrific things these prisoners endured when their bodies were cut into and they were operated on. The blood-curdling screaming and howling in pain. Another experiment was having prisoners enter pressure chambers where their bodies were squeezed to the point that eyeballs would pop out of sockets. Very few people survived the cruel experiments of the Togo unit at Zhongma Fortress, and ultimately none survived. For those that made it through their initial round of whatever experimentation they had undergone, if they were too weak to be tested further, they were put to death, often by way of lethal injection or being shot. There have been reports as well that some unlucky prisoners may have also been buried alive. Life expectancy at Zhongma was, at the high end, 1 month. Prisoner totals usually hovered around 500 to 600 at any given time, although there was enough space to accommodate up to 1,000. Keep in mind that up to this point we're still discussing the horrors of the subject precursor Togo unit, and we haven't yet come to Unit 731. In August of 1934, during the period of the annual summer festival, Zhongma Fortress experienced its first prison break. A prisoner, only remembered by the name Li, was able to overpower a guard and take his set of keys, which he used to free 40 other prisoners. Due to a torrential downpour, the electricity to the perimeter fences and searchlights had been knocked out. Though each prisoner's legs were shackled, they were able to use their freed arms to climb the walls. Of the 40 that were freed by Li, only 16 managed to escape. 10 were shot by the guards while climbing the walls, while others were recaptured. And believe me, you did not want to be recaptured. Of the 16 that escaped, some succumbed to the elements, in addition to starvation and injury from the escape attempt. Those that managed to make it into civilization began to spread the word about the crimes against humanity that were being committed by Lieutenant General Ishii and his Togo unit in Manchuria. Unfortunately for the escapees, the Kuomintang, the national Chinese government, paid absolutely zero attention to any of these reports. Much of what we know today came from the events told to us by Shi Young Wang, one of the only known escapees of Zhongma. The following year, the Zhongma Fortress suffered an internal explosion that was believed to be sabotage. Because of this event, and the prior prison break, General Ishii was concerned about the potential information leak from the escapees. As a result, he shut down the Zhongma Fortress. From the Japanese army, he gained permission to move the facility to a new spot, 24 kilometers south of Harbin, into a new area known as Pingfang. Here, he created a new facility to continue his experimentation, one that had newer capabilities and was much larger. Now, if you were thinking that this top-secret experimentation was hidden from the highest levels of government, then I'm here to tell you that you're dead wrong. In 1936, the Japanese Emperor Showa, or, as he was better known in the West, Hirohito, signed a new decree, one which expanded on this unit, even integrating it into the Kwangtung Army. On integration, it was established as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. This was broken into 2 separate units. The first was the Wakamatsu unit, the second, the Ishii unit. The Ishii unit, of course, better known as the subject of today's episode, Unit 731. Other aliases are the Manchu Detachment or the Camo Detachment. Unit 731 was comprised of 8 divisions. Division 1, Infectious Disease Research on Live Human Subjects. Their building contained around 300 to 400 prisoners. Division 2, Bioweapons Research. Division 3, Bioweapon Production. Division 4, Bacteria Mass Production and Storage. Division 5, Personnel Training. And Divisions 6 through 8, the Logistics Wing, for equipment, medical, and administration. The unit was also not only located in Harbin, but had branches in Lingkou, Mudanjiang, Hailin, Sunwu, Towan, and Hailar, in addition to a medical school and R&D facility in Tokyo. Inside their new prison, Unit 731 conducted experiments that truly earned the name Crimes Against Humanity. So you have an understanding of what these were. I'll tell you about them. For prisoners delivered to Unit 731, this was a one-way trip, for no one ever came out alive. There was an attempted prison break by Soviet inmates. However, they were unable to navigate the internal complex of the prison and were shot to death. Each prisoner coming in was transported at night, brought to the unit in the painted black vehicles. There were no windows in the back, only a small ventilation hole, when the vehicle arrived to the gates of Unit 731, a complex which was sprawled over 6 square kilometers. The driver would head into the guard room and report to the night watchman. From here, a call was placed to the inside of the facility, and a special reception team would then come out and take charge of the prisoner. The team wore white suits, army hats, rubber boots, and were armed with pistols, leading the prisoners through a secret tunnel that led to the central building. Here, if there were multiple prisoners in one run, they were split up. Men were housed in Building 7, while women and children were housed in Building 8. The prisoners were immediately subject to testing, such as the taking of blood and stool samples. As they were deemed healthy, and worse over, fit for experimentation, they were assigned 3-digit prisoner numbers, completely stripping away their names. The average life expectancy of those incarcerated at Unit 731 was 2 months, although some were unfortunate to live for as long as a year. Each prisoner's cell was a near windowless box, with wooden floors and a squat toilet. There was space in front of each cell, as well as behind, to allow for the transit of guards conducting rounds. Prisoners could also be monitored through a small window in the door. No non-inmate was allowed into the facility without proper identification, a pass that was complete with your picture. The experiments on vivisection that were started at the Zhongma Fortress continued at Unit 731. Organs were removed and examined while prisoners were still alive, and left out to see how they would decompose after death. Some had limbs removed and reattached on the other side or different areas of the body. Others had limbs crushed or circulation cut off, so scientists could study the effects of gangrene. They also experimented with blood transfusions, like giving human experiments horse blood in an effort to study if a transfusion would be successful, and what clotting times of injuries looked like. Thousands of prisoners suffered this experimentation, often being injected with deadly diseases and then opened up to see the effect on the body. Testimony was provided under condition of anonymity to the publication The New York Times by a Japanese medical assistant who was in Unit 731 and recounted his first dissection experience. The fellow knew that it was over for him, so he didn't struggle when they led him into the room and tied him down. But when I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming. I cut him open from the chest to the stomach, and he screamed terribly, and his face was all twisted in agony. He made this unimaginable sound. He was screaming so horribly, but then he stopped. This was all in a day's work for the surgeons, but it really left an impression on me, because it was my first time. Some of the worst testing was that from Japanese weapons of war. Prisoners would be marched onto firing ranges and were shot with a myriad of army weapons. Everything from pistols to rifles, machine guns, and grenades, all in an effort to study wound patterns and penetration depths. Those conducting the experiments also used bayonets, swords, and knives. Although for bladed experiments, prisoners weren't brought onto firing ranges, but were strapped down so they could be cut and couldn't escape. They were also experimented on with flamethrower weaponry to study the effects the weapons had on exposed and non-exposed skin. In the camp's gas chambers, prisoners were experimented on with both nerve gas and blister agents. From an interview with an anonymous former Japanese Army technician, Hal Gould's book, Japan's Infamous Unit 731, a description is given of the gas testing. In 1943, I attended gas tests held at the Unit 731 test facilities. A glass-walled chamber about 3 meters square and 2 meters high was used. Inside of it, a Chinese man was blindfolded, with his hands tied around a post behind him. The gas was atomsite, a sneezing gas, and as the gas filled the chamber, the man went into violent coughing convulsions and began to suffer excruciating pain. More than 10 doctors and technicians were present. After I had watched for about 10 minutes, I couldn't stand it anymore and left the area. I understand that other types of gases were also tested there. Some prisoners had heavy objects dropped on them to study crush injuries. Others deprived of food and water, purely to see how long before they succumbed to death. There was also experimentation of prolonged exposure to X-rays, experiments which sterilized many patients and caused unimaginable burn damage. Some prisoners were loaded into massive centrifuges and spun at incredible speeds to see when the human body lost consciousness, which was around 10 to 15 on the G-force scale. The scientists also discovered simultaneously that children had a lower tolerance for G-force. One of the more well-known tests was completed by physiologist Hisato Yoshimura and has since become known as the frostbite test. Due to his interest in studying the effects of hypothermia and frostbite, Hisato submerged his prisoners' limbs into tubs that were filled to the brim with water and ice. He had his guards hold the prisoners in that position until the limb froze solid and a good layer of ice had formed over it. By some eyewitness accounts, the limbs sounded like a plank of wood when they were struck with objects. Following the freeze, it was Hisato's goal and purpose to attempt different methods for expedient or rapid rewarming. Oftentimes, this came in the way of pouring boiling hot water over the limb or exposing it to open flame. Equally as cruel, sometimes the prisoner was left overnight to see how long the person's blood took to rewarm the limb on its own. Yoshimura, in a unit filled with horrible people, was referred to as a scientific devil and a cold-blooded animal. In a testament given by one of these members, Naoji Uezano, he recalled an experiment done by Yoshimura, in which 2 middle-aged men were submerged in a pool that was 40 degrees below zero. The research team was forced to film the exposure until the men died. It was such a horrible experiment that the 2 men were found together, having dug their nails into each other's flesh. Years later, in the Journal of Japanese Physiology, Hisato Yoshimura admitted to experimenting on up to 20 children per day, even admitting to once submerging a 3-day-old infant baby in freezing salt water. He denied having any guilt and showed no remorse for conducting these experiments. Another of the priority problems that Unit 731 attempted to solve was the prevention and cure of venereal diseases, something that has plagued militaries since antiquity. One of the key focal diseases they were trying to prevent was syphilis. At first, prisoners in these trials were administered the disease by injection and not provided any treatment so the scientists could witness the effects of the disease unencumbered. Over the next few months, the prisoners were administered modern treatments such as the chemotherapy agent salvarsan. As much as they were attempting to figure out how to treat syphilis, they were also monitoring the side effects of the treatments given. Eventually, the administration of syphilis changed from injections to rape. Male prisoners who had contracted syphilis were ordered to rape other prisoners of both sexes. If it failed to take in the desired prisoners for testing, they were raped again and again until it did. From the testament of a prison guard in Unit 731, we gain the following insight. Infection of venereal disease by injection was abandoned, and the researchers started forcing the prisoners into sexual acts with one another. 4 or 5 unit members, dressed in white laboratory clothing, completely covering the body with only eyes and mouth visible, the rest covered, handled the tests. A male and female, one infected with syphilis, were brought together in a cell and forced into sex with one another. It was made clear that anyone resisting would be shot. But it wasn't simply the forced rape between prisoners that was noted. Even Unit 731 staff took part, with those uninfected, as attested by a member of the unit. One of the former researchers I located told me that one day he had a human experiment scheduled, but there was still time to kill. So he and another unit member took the keys to the cells and opened one that housed a Chinese woman. One of the unit members raped her. The other took the keys and opened another cell. There was a Chinese woman in there who had recently been used in a frostbite experiment. She had several fingers missing, and her bones were black, with gangrene set in. He was about to rape her anyway, and then he saw that her sex organ was festering, with pus oozing to the surface. He gave up the idea, left, and locked the door, then later went on to his experimental work. Some of those victims who suffered the worst with Unit 731 were pregnant women. Like the syphilitic experiments, rape was a popular form of creating new areas of testing. Female prisoners were raped, or, on occasion, forcibly impregnated and forced to take part in both weapon-based and vivisection experiments. They weren't saved from any form of testing due to their status, suffering crush injuries, bullets, and shrapnel. Also, the scientists of 731 could open them up and study the effects of the tests on the fetus. You might think that after so much suffering, that something might have come out of it, that all the needless death and torture might have contributed in some way to civilian medical practices. Well, I'm here to tell you that no documentation from Unit 731's experiments survived the Second World War. Other parts of 731 continued focus on the development of biological weaponry. One of the more notable versions of this was the development of plague-infected fleas, which were dropped by low-flying airplanes over the Chinese cities of Ningbo and Shangde in the Hunan province. The victims of this biological warfare numbered in the tens of thousands of those people infected with bubonic plagued fleas and the resultant epidemics. In the city of Nanjing, the unit spread typhoid and paratyphoid into wells and marshes so that it made its way into the city's houses. They also infected food stocks, which furthered the epidemics. In the end, the resultant success was in realizing that the most effective way to kill their Chinese victims was through the use of paratyphoid, labeling it the most effective of pathogens. In all, the unit conducted 12 large-scale bioweapon field assessments and 11 different Chinese cities. The aforementioned Shangde experiment cost the lives of 10,000 Chinese citizens and even 1,700 ill-prepared Japanese soldiers. Mainly, the assessments were conducted by the dropping of bombs, infecting food and water supplies, clothing, and the release of pathogen-riddled insects. Through all of their tests, their epidemics, and the spreading of deadly diseases, an estimated number of between 280 and 500,000 Chinese civilians were killed. These attacks on civilians was condemned by the United States under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1943, and then joined by other Western Allied powers shortly after. Had the Japanese not surrendered when they did, the Californian city of San Diego was scheduled for a delivery of fleas dropped by kamikaze pilots in an operation named Cherry Blossoms at Night on the 22nd of September in 1945. At the peak of its operation, around 3,000 prisoners were provided to Unit 731 each year by the military police. Although they were not alone in their experimentation, as other units existed, such as the Manchuria units 100 and 516. The number of victims of Unit 731 numbers in the tens of thousands, with former unit member Okawa Fukumatsu, a member who conducted vivisection experiments, stating that he alone was even responsible for the vivisection of thousands. The experiments of Unit 731 continued until the end of the war in the Pacific. Shiro Ishii even tried to implement his biological weaponry in the Pacific Theater, beginning in mid-May 1944. But his efforts were in vain, as he was denied at every turn by the Imperial Army. In the waning days of the war, knowing that the unit was nearing its end, and the nation, its defeat, all those prisoners still housed in Unit 731 were executed. The 300 remaining prisoners were either gassed or administered poison, while the 600 Chinese workers and laborers were shot. No survivors were documented, and Unit 731 did everything possible to destroy any shred of crimes against humanity, documentation, and evidence. As a last order, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii ordered each and every one of Unit 731 to disappear and to take their secret to the grave. The last days of the war saw the remnant force of Unit 731 destroy the facilities and the remainder of the evidence. Some parts of the complex, however, were sturdy enough to withstand repeated blasts and were abandoned as was. In September of 1945, following the surrender of Japan to the United States, an officer named Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders landed in Yokohama. The respected microbiologist had no prior knowledge of Unit 731, but was sent to investigate bioweapons activity in Japan. No one came forward, offering any information until Sanders threatened Soviet intervention in Japan. A move that would have, on uncovering Soviet prisoners being experimented on, would have spelled disaster for the Japanese. Some informants began to come forward with details about the weaponry production and human experimentation. When this was brought to General Douglas MacArthur, a deal was struck with the informants. The physicians of Unit 731 were granted immunity, including Shiro Ishii. Immunity from prosecution in exchange for sharing of their information and results with the United States, and only the United States. It seems shady, but the United States didn't want that research to fall into Soviet hands. Following this, the physicians were heavily monitored. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal the following year, only one mention of experiments with poisonous serums was made. On his deathbed, the last member of the tribunal still living harbored malcontent about the situation. It is a bitter experience for me to be informed now that centrally ordered Japanese war criminality of the most disgusting kind was kept secret from the court by the U.S. government. Japan's allies, the fallen Third Reich, were not given the same immunity. The Nazi physicians had their experimentation put on full display. The entire population of Unit 731 perpetrators were spared. Another tribunal was held in 1948, prosecuting physicians, professors, and medical students who conducted experiments on captured downed pilots. 2 of the physicians were put to death, while the remainder received 15 to 20-year prison sentences. They may have escaped justice from the United States, however the Soviets were not as forgiving, or as secretive. The Soviet Union prosecuted the top military leaders and scientists of Unit 731 at the Khabarovsk war crimes trial in December of 1949, bringing them up on charges of war crimes. Those found guilty were given sentences that ranged from 2 to 25 years at forced labor camps in Siberia. The United States took an interesting stance on this, refusing to recognize the trials and even labeling them communist propaganda. The Soviets in return hit the nail on the head, accusing the U.S. of giving the Japanese immunity in exchange for their results. The Soviets weren't innocent either, however, as evidence was found that they were building a bioweapons facility in the Sverdlovsk Oblast, using information captured from Unit 731, likely bargained off for leniency in sentencing. Over the decades that followed, the Japanese government offered up no confirmation of the existence of Unit 731, and many court cases followed. They spoke lightly of this subject in the 90s, and did not want to discuss anything they were involved in. In August of 2002, a Tokyo court ruled that the Japanese were involved in biological warfare. A landmark judgment, as this was the first time the Japanese couldn't hide what they did. The judge ruled that they were involved in the spreading of infectious diseases, leading to countless deaths. He in turn, however, rejected all compensation claims, saying that they were determined to be already covered by international peace treaties. In 2003, the Prime Minister of Japan, Junichiro Koizumi, states that the government was not in possession of any records of Unit 731. But, understanding that it was a delicate subject, he agreed to share any records that came forward in the future. It wasn't until 2018 that the National Archives of Japan published the entire list of the 3,607 names, naming each member of Unit 731. Finally, these demons could no longer hide, and their names out in open for what they had done. As I mentioned in the beginning, we far too often hear of the Holocaust and the millions of lives that were lost, and rarely do we hear about things like this. Those hundreds of thousands of Chinese lives, of Soviet lives, Mongolian and Korean lives that should never be forgotten. The horrible things that happened at the Zhongma Fortress and in Unit 731 mark pages of our history. Far too often do people forget about things like this, but it's important that we, as humanity, never do. With this message, we bring to close the story of Unit 731 and their unforgivable crimes against humanity. I hope you learned of a historical event you hadn't before, or maybe learned something new in the event you already heard this story. Before you go, remember to subscribe so you can find your way back next week for another insidious story from our history. I'm looking forward to bringing you lots of amazing new stories in the podcast's second season. And if it's not too much trouble, I'd ask that you share this podcast with a friend. Let's get people talking. New episodes of the Insidious Agenda Podcast release every Tuesday at midnight Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. I'm Nick, your host, and I'll see you again next week. Thank you for listening.